The produce section of Greenleaf Market erupted into chaos when Kwon Min-jae's bodyguard shoved a vendor so hard the man's cart of mangoes exploded across the polished floor. Min-jae didn't flinch. He never did. His daughter Sena stood beside him in her school uniform, her small hand tucked into his, her dark eyes watching the scrambling workers with the eerie calm of a child who'd grown up in silence. The market manager rushed over, apologizing in Yoruba, then English, then attempting Korean before Min-jae raised one hand and the man's voice died in his throat like a candle snuffed out. "Just shopping," Min-jae said quietly, his Nigerian accent wrapped around Korean precision. "Tell your people to breathe." But they couldn't breathe. Everyone in Lagos knew who Kwon Min-jae was. The Korean who'd arrived 15 years ago with soul connections and African ambition, who'd built an empire spanning shipping, real estate, and shadows deeper than the Bight of Benin. The man whose wife died giving birth, whose daughter lived in perpetual silence, whose grief had calcified into something harder than diamonds and twice as sharp. When Min-jae walked through Lagos, the city held its breath. Thandiwe Mwangi watched this from aisle 7, her hands frozen on a box of cornflakes she'd been stocking. She'd been working the evening shift at Greenleaf for 8 months, one of 2 jobs she juggled to keep her son Malik in school and food on their table. Former Nigerian Army medic, widow of a hero, now a woman who survived on 4 hours of sleep and the memory of better days. She recognized Min-jae immediately. Everyone did. But what caught her attention wasn't the man or his reputation. It was the little girl. Sena moved through the aisles with practiced silence, her fingers trailing across bright packages she couldn't hear crinkle, past shoppers whose whispers never reached her ears. She was beautiful, her Korean and Nigerian heritage blended into features that would have turned heads anywhere, but there was something else. Something that made Thandiwe's medic instinct snap to attention like she was back in field hospitals outside Maiduguri. The girl touched her right ear. A brief gesture, almost hidden. Then again. And again, each time followed by the smallest wince, a tightening around her eyes that spoke of chronic discomfort so familiar she'd learned to hide it. Thandiwe's heart rate kicked up. She'd seen that gesture before. Not in children with genetic deafness or sensorineural hearing loss. In soldiers after explosions, in accident victims, in cases where something physical blocked the pathway of sound. She abandoned her cornflakes and moved closer, pretending to organize cereal boxes while her eyes tracked Sena. When the girl turned her head, Thandiwe's breath caught. There, visible even from 3 meters away in the fluorescent lights, was a dark mass partially occluding Sena's ear canal. Not the expected clear opening. Something else. Something that shouldn't be there. Thandiwe's hand started shaking. She gripped a box of Cheerios so hard it crumpled. This couldn't be what she thought it was. Not with a man like Min-jae, who had the resources to fly his daughter to the best specialists in the world. Not after 9 years. It was impossible. But her training screamed otherwise. Before we continue, can I ask you a question? Where in the world are you watching from? Comment below because we would love to know how far these stories travel, and hit that subscribe button because there are new stories you do not want to miss. Thandiwe's husband Joseph used to tell her that the most dangerous moment in medicine wasn't when you didn't know what was wrong, it was when you knew exactly what was wrong and had to decide whether to act. He'd said this in their small quarters at the Jiwa barracks in Maiduguri, 3 months before an IED turned him into a memory and a folded flag. She'd carried his words through her discharge from the army, through the hollow years of single motherhood, through every moment she'd wanted to give up but couldn't because Malik needed her. Now those words echoed as she watched Min-jae guide Sena toward the checkout lanes, bodyguards flanking them like sharks around prey. She had maybe 60 seconds to decide. If she was wrong, she'd humiliate herself in front of one of West Africa's most dangerous men. If she was right and said nothing, a 9-year-old girl would continue living in silence when the solution might be breathtakingly simple. If she was right and spoke up, she'd be inserting herself into the orbit of a man whose enemies disappeared into the Atlantic Ocean and whose grief was legendary. Thandiwe thought of Malik, 7 years old, who'd asked her yesterday why Daddy's pictures never talked back. She thought of Joseph's smile, the way he'd believed healing was worth any risk. She thought of every moment her own son had laughed, sung, called her name, sounds this beautiful child had never experienced. Her feet moved before her brain authorized them. "Mr. Kwon," she called out, her voice carrying across the produce section with the authority of someone who'd once commanded field triage in combat zones. "Sir, please wait." The bodyguards moved instantly. The taller one, built like a concrete wall with tribal marks across his cheekbones, stepped into her path. The other, shorter but meaner, had his hand inside his jacket. Min-jae turned slowly, his expression the careful blank of a man who'd learned to show nothing because showing anything was weakness. "I don't sign autographs," he said in English, his tone of polite ice. "And I don't accept petitions. I'm not asking for either." Thandi stopped 3 meters away, hands visible, body language open. "My name is Thandiwe Mwangi. I'm a former Nigerian Army medic, serving 6 years including field hospitals in Borno State. I work here part-time and as a hospital receptionist at Lagoon Medical Center." Min-jae's eyes narrowed slightly. "Congratulations on your service. Now if you'll excuse us. It's about your daughter." The temperature in the market dropped 10 degrees. The tall bodyguard shifted his weight. Somewhere behind the deli counter, someone dropped a glass bottle and the crash seemed to echo forever. Min-jae's expression didn't change but something happened behind his eyes, a glacial shift that made Thandi understand exactly why people feared him. "Choose your next words very carefully," he said softly. Thandi's pulse hammered in her ears but her voice stayed steady. "I'm not trying to offend you, sir. But I've been watching your daughter, and I've noticed something. She keeps touching her right ear. It's a specific gesture, repetitive, usually followed by slight discomfort. And when she turned her head, I saw what appeared to be a visible obstruction in her ear canal." "My daughter is deaf," Min-jae said, each word precisely placed like stones in a wall. "Profound bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. Diagnosed by 17 specialists across 4 continents. Genetic. Irreversible. I've spent 9 years and more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes trying to change that answer. So unless you have a medical degree I don't know about, I suggest you return to stocking shelves." "I don't have a medical degree," Thandi admitted. "But I have 8 years of emergency medical training and field experience, including treating acoustic trauma from explosions. I've seen hundreds of ear injuries, and I'm telling you what I'm seeing doesn't look like sensorineural deafness. It looks like a physical blockage. An impaction." Min-jae laughed, but there was no humor in it. "An impaction? You're telling me that 17 specialists, including Dr. Harrison Chen at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Adebayo at UCH, and Dr. Kim at Seoul National University Hospital, all missed an ear blockage that a grocery store clerk spotted across an aisle? I'm telling you what I see." Thandi took one careful step forward. The bodyguards tensed but Min-jae raised a finger and they froze. "I could be completely wrong. But if there's even a chance I'm right, don't you want to know? What do you lose by letting me look?" 5 minutes of your time. "What I lose," Min-jae said, his voice dropping to something below freezing, "is more hope. Do you understand? Every time someone tells me they can help, every time I let myself believe there's a chance, and then there isn't, I lose something I can't get back. My daughter doesn't understand why I keep dragging her to doctors who poke and prod and run tests that lead nowhere. She doesn't understand why her father can't fix this one thing when he can fix everything else in her life. So no, Mrs. Mwangi, I don't want another 5 minutes of false hope." Sena tugged on her father's sleeve. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read tension in body language better than most adults read words. She signed something in Korean Sign Language, quick gestures that made Min-jae's jaw tighten. "She asks if you're going to hurt the nice lady," he translated, his voice rough. "My daughter has developed an unfortunate habit of worrying about others when she should be worried about herself." Thandi looked at Sena directly. The girl had her father's intensity but something softer too, an openness that money and power couldn't buy. Thandi crouched down to Sena's height, ignoring the bodyguards who shifted like attack dogs on fraying leashes. She signed slowly, her KSL rusty but serviceable from her time treating Korean UN peacekeepers. "Hello. I am Thandi. I want to help if I can. May I look at your ear? It won't hurt. Sena's eyes widened. She looked up at her father, then back at Thandi, then signed, "You know how to talk with hands?" "A little," Thandi signed back. "I learned from soldiers who taught me. They were very patient with my mistakes." Something in Sena's expression shifted, a cautious curiosity replacing the guarded wariness. She signed to her father, gestures Thandi couldn't follow, and Min-jae's mask finally cracked. Not much. Just enough to show the exhausted, desperate father beneath the crime lord. "She says if you know hand-talking, maybe you see things other doctors don't," Min-jae said quietly. "She wants to give you a chance." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of every failed hope that came before. 5 minutes. Here. Now. If you waste my time or upset my daughter, you'll regret being born. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Thandi said, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. They moved to a quieter corner near the pharmacy section. Min-jae sent one bodyguard to keep curious shoppers away. The other stood close enough that Thandi could smell his cologne and see the outline of his weapon. She pulled a small penlight from her work vest, the same one she carried during her hospital shifts, and carefully approached Sena. "This will be bright but not hurt," she signed, then switched to speaking for Min-jae's benefit. "I'm just going to look. If she feels uncomfortable at any point, we stop. Okay?" Sena nodded. Up close, Thandi could see the intelligence in the girl's eyes, the hyper-awareness of someone who'd learned to read the world through vision and touch alone. She could also see the subtle signs of chronic pain, the way Sena held her head slightly tilted to favor her left side, the faint redness around her right ear from frequent touching. Thandi gently angled Sena's head and aimed the penlight into her ear canal. What she saw made her breath catch. The ear canal was partially occluded by a dense, dark brown mass that had the characteristic appearance of severely impacted cerumen mixed with something else, possibly skin cells and debris that had accumulated and hardened over years. But it wasn't a complete blockage, which explained why audiological tests might show some response while still missing the physical cause. The mass was positioned in a way that would dampen sound significantly while not appearing obviously abnormal on surface examination, especially if specialists were expecting genetic deafness and therefore not looking for physical obstructions. But there was more. Behind the impaction, she could see signs of chronic inflammation and fluid buildup, suggesting possible secondary infection or effusion that had gone untreated. This wasn't just an earwax blockage. This was years of accumulated damage resulting from an initial impaction that had been missed, ignored, or mistaken for something else. "Oh my God," Thandi whispered. "What?" Min-jae's voice was sharp. "What do you see?" Thandi pulled back, her hands shaking. "Mr. Kwon, I need to check her other ear." She repeated the examination on the left side. Similar but not as severe, a smaller impaction that still would significantly reduce hearing. Both ears affected, both treatable, both fixable with proper intervention. 9 years of silence because of something that should have been caught in a routine pediatric examination. "Tell me what you see," Min-jae demanded, his composure fracturing. "Now." "She has severe bilateral cerumen impaction with possible secondary complications," Thandi said, forcing herself to speak clearly despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Both ear canals are partially blocked by hardened masses of earwax, debris, and cellular material. The right side is worse than the left. This would absolutely cause significant hearing loss, potentially profound enough to mimic sensorineural deafness on standard audiological tests, especially if the examiners were predisposed to expect genetic causes." Min-jae stared at her. "You're saying my daughter is deaf because of earwax?" "I'm saying she might be deaf because of a complex impaction that's been building for years, possibly since infancy or early childhood, that has caused chronic inflammation and secondary complications. This isn't simple earwax. This is a medical condition that required monitoring and intervention, and for whatever reason, she didn't receive that." "That's impossible." But Min-jae's voice lacked conviction. "Dr. Adeyemi examined her 6 months ago. Full workup. He said nothing about any blockage. Did he look in her ears with an otoscope? I don't know. He did tests. Audio tests. Brain scans. He said her auditory nerves were damaged. Mr. Kwon, with respect, if he didn't perform a basic physical examination of her ear canals with proper lighting and magnification, he wouldn't have seen this. And if the impaction has been present for most of her life, audiological tests would show reduced function that could be misinterpreted as nerve damage, especially by doctors looking for more complex explanations. Min-jae's hand came up to his mouth. He stood absolutely still for a long moment, and Thandiwe watched 9 years of grief, rage, and desperate hope battle across his features. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Can you fix it? Not here, Thandiwe said immediately. This needs to be done properly, in a medical setting, with proper equipment and under controlled conditions. The impaction is severe and has been there a long time. Removing it requires precision and care. If done incorrectly, it could damage the ear canal or eardrum. But yes, Mr. Kwon, if what I'm seeing is accurate, this is treatable. How treatable? Thandiwe met his eyes. If there's no permanent damage to the structures behind the blockage, if the eardrum is intact, if the ossicles and cochlea are functional, your daughter could potentially hear again. I can't promise anything. There may be complications I can't see. But this is not irreversible genetic deafness. This is a physical obstruction that has likely been present since early childhood, possibly congenital, that has caused secondary issues but may still be correctable. Min-jae turned away, his shoulders rigid. One of his bodyguards looked uncertain, glancing between his boss and Thandiwe like he wasn't sure whether to protect Min-jae from good news or bad. Sena, sensing her father's distress, reached up and took his hand. She signed something quick, and Min-jae let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. She asks if I'm crying, he said roughly. She's never seen me cry. She thinks something is wrong. He dropped to his knees in the middle of Greenleaf Market, this man who commanded fear and respect across 2 continents, and pulled his daughter into his arms. He signed something against her hair, his hands shaking, and Sena hugged him back with the fierce strength of a child who loved her father more than anything in her silent world. Before we continue, can I ask you a question? Where in the world are you watching from? Comment below because we would love to know how far these stories travel, and hit that subscribe button because there are new stories you do not want to miss. 20 minutes later, they were in Min-jae's black Mercedes S-Class, Thandiwe sandwiched between the 2 bodyguards in the back while Min-jae sat in front with Sena. The driver navigated Lagos traffic with the aggressive precision of someone who knew exactly how much space a luxury vehicle could claim by force of reputation alone. No one had asked if Thandiwe wanted to come. Min-jae had simply said we're going to Lagoon Medical Center. Now, and his bodyguards had escorted her to the car with the polite inevitability of a riptide. I need to call my son, Thandiwe said, pulling out her phone. He's with a neighbor. I need to tell her I'll be late. Tell her you'll be very late, Min-jae said without turning around, and that you'll receive compensation for your time. I don't want compensation. I want to help your daughter. You'll receive it anyway. Min-jae's phone rang and he answered in Korean, his voice sharp and commanding. He barked orders about clearing a private examination room, getting specific doctors on call, having equipment ready. Thandiwe caught enough to understand he was calling in favors from the hospital administrators, the kind of favors that involved implied threats and certain obligations. Sena kept turning around to look at Thandiwe, her expression curious and hopeful in equal measure. Each time their eyes met, the girl would smile slightly, and each smile made Thandiwe's chest tighten with the weight of what she'd started. If she was wrong, if this was something else, if the removal caused complications or didn't restore hearing, she would have given this man false hope and hurt this beautiful child. The responsibility felt like drowning. They pulled up to Lagoon Medical Center's private entrance. Min-jae made a phone call and within seconds, Dr. Adeyemi himself appeared, looking flustered and nervous in expensive surgical scrubs. He was a tall Yoruba man in his 50s with silver-threaded hair and the kind of practiced smile that Thandiwe had seen on doctors who charged more for their bedside manner than their medical expertise. Mr. Kwon, I came as soon as I received your call, Dr. Adeyemi said, his English carrying the crisp British accent of overseas medical training. Though I must say, I'm confused about the urgency. We just completed Sena's evaluation 6 months ago, and as I explained then, her condition is. Get an otoscope, Min-jae interrupted. The real one. Not whatever you used before. I want you to examine my daughter's ears. Physically. Right now. Dr. Adeyemi's professional smile flickered. Mr. Kwon, I assure you I conducted a thorough examination. Sena's hearing loss is profound and bilateral, consistent with genetic sensorineural. Did you look in her ears? The question hung in the sterile hallway like a blade. Dr. Adeyemi's smile disappeared entirely. Of course I conducted a standard otoscopic examination as part of the initial. 6 months ago. Did you look in her ears 6 months ago? A pause. Too long. Too telling. The focus of that visit was audiological testing to assess changes in her hearing threshold and to discuss potential cochlear implant candidacy, Dr. Adeyemi said carefully. Given her established diagnosis of sensorineural hearing loss, a basic otoscopic examination was not deemed necessary unless there were specific symptoms suggesting. So you didn't look. Mr. Kwon, with all respect, your daughter's condition has been confirmed by multiple specialists. The most recent imaging shows. Get an otoscope. They moved to a private examination room that probably cost more per hour than Thandiwe made in a week. Dr. Adeyemi retrieved an otoscope with video capability, projecting the image onto a large monitor. His hands were steady, but Thandiwe noticed the slight sheen of sweat on his forehead. Whatever else he was, Dr. Adeyemi was a smart man who'd just realized he might have made a catastrophic mistake. He examined Sena's right ear first. The moment the image appeared on the monitor, he went absolutely still. The screen showed exactly what Thandiwe had seen in the grocery store, but in magnified detail, a massive, complex impaction that had clearly been present for years, causing visible inflammation and damage to the surrounding tissue. Not subtle. Not hidden. Impossible to miss if you were actually looking. Dear God, Dr. Adeyemi whispered. Min-jae's voice was perfectly calm, which somehow made it more terrifying. Explain what I'm seeing, doctor. That appears to be a significant cerumen impaction with associated. In language I understand. Dr. Adeyemi swallowed hard. Your daughter has a severe earwax blockage that has likely been present for years. Both ears, based on what I'm seeing. This would cause profound hearing loss that could mimic sensorineural deafness on audiological testing. Could this have been removed? Yes. It's a standard procedure. At any point in the last 9 years? Silence. Dr. Adeyemi, Min-jae said softly, I asked you a question. Yes, the doctor said, his voice barely audible. This should have been identified and treated years ago. It's a standard part of pediatric examination. The fact that it wasn't caught suggests either incompetence or, he stopped himself. Or what? Min-jae turned around slowly, and Thandiwe saw something in his eyes that made her understand exactly why this man's enemies disappeared. Finish your sentence. Or deliberate oversight, Thandiwe interjected, unable to stay silent. Dr. Adeyemi, when did you first examine Sena? The doctor looked at her like noticing a mosquito that might carry malaria. I'm sorry, who are you? Answer her question, Min-jae said. I first saw Sena when she was 3 years old, Dr. Adeyemi said stiffly. She was referred by her pediatrician after concerns about her lack of speech development. And did you perform an otoscopic examination then? Another pause. Another tell. I would have to check my notes from that initial visit. You did, Thandiwe said flatly. You had to have. It's standard protocol for any child presenting with hearing or speech concerns. Which means you saw this impaction 7 years ago. And you said nothing. Dr. Adeyemi's face was drained of color. That's a serious accusation. Is it wrong? Min-jae moved so fast that Thandiwe barely saw it. One moment he was by the door, the next he had Dr. Adeyemi pressed against the wall, one hand around the doctor's throat. The bodyguards didn't move. This was their employer's right. My daughter, Min-jae said, each word enunciated with perfect, deadly clarity, has lived in silence for 9 years. 9 years. I have spent millions of dollars flying her around the world, consulting with specialists who all told me there was no hope. I have watched her learn sign language instead of Korean and Igbo. I have seen her cry because she doesn't understand why she's different. I have blamed myself for her condition, wondered if it was something in my genetics or my wife's, carried guilt that has eaten me alive. And you're telling me it was treatable the entire time? Mr. Kwon, please. Why? The word was a raw wound. Why would you hide this? Why would you let my daughter suffer? I wasn't, Dr. Adeyemi was gasping, tears streaming down his face. You have to understand, you came to me desperate, willing to try anything, and the treatments I suggested, the therapies, they were legitimate options for sensorineural hearing loss, which is what the initial referral suggested. But it wasn't sensorineural hearing loss. I thought it might develop into, there were theories about progression, the experimental treatments you funded, they were real research that could have helped if. How much? Min-jae's voice dropped to a whisper. How much did you make off my daughter's suffering? Dr. Adeyemi said nothing. How much? Roughly $800,000 over 7 years, the doctor finally admitted. From treatment recommendations, experimental therapy consultations, specialist referrals to colleagues who paid me commission, medical equipment purchases. Min-jae let him go so suddenly Dr. Adeyemi collapsed to the floor. The crime lord walked to the window, his back rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. Sena had been sitting quietly in the examination chair, watching everything with wide eyes. She didn't need to hear to understand that something terrible had been revealed. Get out, Min-jae said quietly. Mr. Kwon, I can explain. If you're still in this building in 60 seconds, my men will put you in the ocean. Get out. Dr. Adeyemi ran. Thandi heard his footsteps echoing down the hallway like gunshots. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Min-jae turned around, and Thandi saw that he was crying. Silent. Tears running down his face while his expression remained perfectly composed, creating a disconnect that was somehow more heartbreaking than open sobbing. Can you do it? He asked Thandi. Can you remove the blockage? I'm not a doctor, Mr. Kwon. I'm a medic. I can assist, but this needs to be done by a qualified ENT specialist. Every specialist I've trusted has failed me. Worse than failing. They lied. He walked over to Sena, dropped to his knees in front of her, took her small hands in his. I need someone I can trust. Someone who saw what others didn't. Someone who gave me the truth when truth cost her safety. He looked up at Thandi. I'm asking you. Please. Help my daughter. Thandi felt the weight of 3 lives pressing down on her shoulders, this powerful, broken man, his innocent daughter, and somewhere across Lagos, her own son waiting for his mother to come home. She thought of Joseph again, his steady hands and steadier heart, the way he'd always chosen to help even when helping was dangerous. We need proper equipment, she finally said. A certified ENT physician to supervise and take legal responsibility, proper anesthesia or sedation depending on complexity. And we need to explain everything to Sena in a way she understands, so she's not scared. Done. All of it. Name what you need. Thandi pulled out her phone and called Dr. Chinua Okoro, a Nigerian ENT specialist she'd worked with at Lagoon Medical who had both the skills and the integrity this situation required. She explained the situation in brief, clinical terms. Dr. Okoro agreed to come immediately, her voice tight with barely contained fury at Dr. Adeyemi's malfeasance. While they waited, Thandi sat with Sena and explained in sign language what was going to happen. She kept it simple, honest, and hopeful without making promises she couldn't keep. Sena listened intently, occasionally asking questions with quick gestures, and by the end she seemed more curious than afraid. She wants to know if it will hurt, Min-jae translated one of Sena's signs. Tell her we'll make sure she doesn't feel pain, Thandi signed directly to Sena. She might feel pressure or strange sensations, but not hurt. And I'll be there the whole time. Why are you doing this? Min-jae asked suddenly. You don't know us. You could have walked away in that grocery store. You still could. Why risk yourself for strangers? Thandi thought about how to answer. She could tell him about Joseph, about the values of service drilled into her through military training, about what it meant to be a healer. But what came out was simpler and more true. Because she's 9 years old and she deserves to hear her father tell her he loves her, Thandi said. Because I have a son who can hear, and every time he laughs or calls my name, I'm grateful for something I never think about otherwise. Because I saw something that needed fixing, and I can't pretend I didn't see it just because fixing it is complicated or scary. And because, she stopped, surprised by the emotion catching in her throat. Because your daughter looked at me with hope in her eyes, and I can't walk away from that. Min-jae held her gaze for a long moment. You're either the bravest or most foolish person I've ever met. My husband used to say those were the same thing. Used to? He died 5 years ago. Nigerian Army medic, killed in Borno State by an improvised explosive device while treating wounded soldiers. The words came easier now, worn smooth by repetition. He believed that healing was worth dying for. I'm still trying to decide if he was right. I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for yours too. They understood each other then, these two people from completely different worlds, united by the specific gravity of parental love and devastating loss. Min-jae's wife, Thandi's husband, both left too soon, leaving holes that their children couldn't fill but gave them reason to keep standing despite the holes. Dr. Okoro arrived 40 minutes later with 2 nurses and enough medical equipment to stock a minor surgical suite. She was a short, powerfully built Igbo woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and zero patience for incompetence. She examined Sena thoroughly, reviewed the otoscopic images, and swore creatively in Igbo for 2 straight minutes. This is medical malpractice of the highest order, she declared. That bastard Adeyemi should lose his license. This child has been suffering for years because of greed and negligence. She turned to Min-jae. I can remove these impactions, but I need to be clear about possibilities. Best case, we remove the blockages, there's no permanent damage, and her hearing improves significantly or fully. In the middle case, there's some damage from chronic inflammation that may require further treatment. Worst case, the structures behind the impaction have been permanently damaged and removal won't restore full hearing. Do you understand? Yes, Min-jae said. Do it. Before we continue, can I ask you a question? Where in the world are you watching from? Comment below because we would love to know how far these stories travel, and hit that subscribe button because there are new stories you do not want to miss. The procedure took 90 minutes. Dr. Okoro worked with meticulous care, using specialized instruments to soften and remove the impacted material piece by piece. Thandi assisted, her field medic training making her steady and useful in ways that surprised the nurses. Sena was given light sedation to keep her calm, and throughout the procedure, Thandi held the girl's hand, maintaining physical contact so Sena wouldn't feel alone in her medicated haze. Min-jae watched from behind the observation glass, his face pressed against it like a child looking into a toy store. His bodyguards stood silent sentinel, and at some point one of them brought Min-jae coffee that went cold in his hands, untouched. The right ear took longer because the impaction was more severe. Dr. Okoro removed material that had been compacted for years, layer upon layer of cerumen, dead skin cells, and debris that had turned into something like concrete. Behind it, the ear canal was inflamed and irritated but structurally intact. The eardrum, when finally visible, showed signs of chronic pressure but no perforation. Oh thank God, Dr. Okoro breathed when she saw the intact tympanic membrane. The structures are damaged but not destroyed. We have a chance. The left ear went faster, the impaction less severe, the damage less extensive. By the time Dr. Okoro finished and cleaned both ear canals, installed temporary protective dressings, and stepped back to assess her work, Thandi was trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Now we wait, Dr. Okoro said. The sedation will wear off in about 20 minutes. When she wakes, we'll see what we've accomplished. Those 20 minutes stretched like centuries. Min-jae came into the recovery room and sat beside his daughter's bed, holding her hand, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or promises or both. Thandiwe collapsed into a chair, suddenly aware that she'd been on her feet for hours and hadn't eaten since her morning shift. One of the nurses brought her water and crackers, which she consumed without tasting. Sena stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then clearing as the sedation faded. She saw her father and smiled, then noticed Thandiwe and smiled wider. She started to sign something, then stopped, her expression confused. She touched her ear gently, careful of the dressing. Then her eyes went wide. Huge. Shocked. Min-jae was speaking to her in Korean, soft reassuring words, but he couldn't sign while holding her hand and she wasn't looking at him anyway. She was staring at the heart rate monitor, at its rhythmic beeping, and her face was transforming through a dozen emotions faster than thought. She made a sound. A small, shocked gasp that turned into something that might have been a word in any language or no language at all. Then she turned to her father and her mouth opened and closed and she was crying, tears streaming down her face, and she was making sounds, actual sounds, broken syllables that held more meaning than any poetry. "Appa," she said clearly, distinctly, in Korean. "Father. Appa, I hear you. I hear you." Min-jae broke. Not a crack in his composure. A complete structural collapse. He pulled Sena into his arms and sobbed into her hair, his shoulders shaking, 9 years of grief and guilt and desperate hope pouring out in heaving gasps while his daughter patted his back and kept saying "Appa, Appa," like she was testing the word, making sure it was real, making sure the sound that came from her mouth matched the vibrations she felt in her father's chest. Thandiwe turned away to give them privacy, but Dr. Okoro grabbed her shoulder and pulled her into a fierce hug. The nurses were crying too, and even Min-jae's bodyguards looked suspiciously shiny-eyed. "You did this, Dr. Okoro whispered in Thandiwe's ear. "You saw what needed to be seen. You're the hero of this story." But Thandiwe didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd stumbled onto a miracle and somehow managed not to destroy it. She felt exhausted and grateful and terrified of how close this had come to never happening. Most of all, she felt Joseph's presence, as if her dead husband was standing beside her, his hand on her back, his voice in her ear saying what he always said, "Good work, medic. Good work." Over the next hour, they tested Sena's hearing carefully, systematically. Both ears showed significant improvement, though the right ear had more residual damage from the longer-term impaction. She could hear conversation at normal volumes. She could distinguish between sounds. She could hear her father's voice saying her name, and every time he said it, she laughed with pure joy. Dr. Okoro explained that there would be a recovery period, possible further treatment for the inflammation, auditory therapy to help Sena learn to process and interpret sounds she'd never experienced before, and ongoing monitoring to ensure full healing. But the prognosis was excellent. Sena would hear. Not perfectly, at least not immediately, but she would hear. The human brain is remarkably plastic, especially in children, Dr. Okoro told Min-jae. Her auditory processing will develop quickly now that the physical barrier is removed. She'll likely need speech therapy to develop verbal language since she's been using sign language exclusively, but children are language sponges. Give her a year, and she'll be chattering away in Korean, Igbo, and English like she was born to it. Min-jae couldn't speak. He just nodded, holding Sena who kept touching her ears and making sounds, testing her voice, exploring this new dimension of existence. It was past midnight when Thandiwe finally left the hospital. Min-jae had arranged for a driver to take her home, and pressed an envelope into her hands that she didn't open until she was in the car. Inside was more money than she made in 6 months, along with a business card and a handwritten note. "This doesn't cover the debt, but it's a start. Call if you or your son ever need anything. Ever. KMJ." She got home to find Malik asleep on her neighbor's couch. Mrs. Okonkwo, a widow herself, had fed him dinner and let him doze off watching cartoons. Thandiwe thanked her profusely, carried her sleeping son home, and tucked him into bed. She sat beside him for a long time, listening to his breathing, overwhelmed with gratitude that he lived in a world of sound and speech and song. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. Sena is asleep. She keeps waking up to make sure she can still hear. The doctors say this is normal. Thank you doesn't begin to cover what you've given us. Min-jae. Thandiwe typed back, tell her she's very brave. And tell yourself that you're a good father. You never stopped trying to help her. The response came quickly, I trusted the wrong people. I should have looked closer. I failed her. You trusted experts. That's not failure, that's reasonable. The experts failed both of you. But we fixed it. She's going to be okay. A long pause. Then, my driver will pick you up tomorrow at 9 a.m. Sena wants to see you. She has questions about sounds and she trusts you to answer them. Please don't say no. Thandiwe smiled despite her exhaustion. I'll be ready. She finally opened the envelope and counted the money. 50,000 naira. More than half a year's salary from both her jobs combined. She sat on her threadbare couch in her tiny apartment and cried, not from relief or gratitude, though she felt both, but from the sheer overwhelming weight of everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. The next morning, Min-jae's driver arrived exactly at 9. Thandiwe had called in sick to both her jobs, a luxury she rarely allowed herself, and dressed in her best clothes, which weren't particularly good but were clean and pressed. Malik came with her, confused but excited by the fancy car and the serious-faced driver. They drove to Min-jae's home in Ikoyi, a sprawling estate behind high walls with security that made Thandiwe think of military installations. The house itself was stunning, modern architecture blended with traditional Korean design elements, surrounded by gardens that probably cost more to maintain than her annual rent. Min-jae met them at the door himself, dressed in casual clothes that probably cost more than Thandiwe's entire wardrobe. But his face was different from yesterday. Softer. Younger somehow. The weight of 9 years of failure had been lifted, and it showed. Thank you for coming, he said, shaking her hand with both of his. Sena has been asking for you since dawn. They found Sena in a sun-filled living room, wearing headphones connected to a tablet, watching what appeared to be educational videos about sounds and how they work. When she saw Thandiwe, she pulled the headphones off and ran over, wrapping her arms around Thandiwe's waist in a fierce hug. I can hear birds, she said in Korean, her pronunciation awkward but understandable. Min-jae translated. I didn't know birds made sounds. Appa said they sing, but I thought singing was just for people. But birds sing too. Everything makes sounds. The refrigerator hums and water splashes in cars make angry noises and, she stopped, overwhelmed, tears streaming down her face. Everything is so loud and beautiful. Thandiwe hugged her back, her own eyes stinging. It is loud, she agreed. Sometimes too loud. You'll learn which sounds are important and which ones to ignore. It takes time. Sena switched to sign language for the next question, more comfortable with the familiar. Why didn't the doctors help me before? Min-jae's face darkened, but Thandiwe answered before he could. Sometimes adults make mistakes. Bad mistakes. The doctors you saw were supposed to help you, but they didn't do their job correctly. That wasn't your fault. It wasn't your father's fault. It was their failure, and they'll have to live with that. Are you a doctor? No, I'm a medic. I help doctors, but I also help people directly when they're hurt or sick. Can you teach me to be a medic? Thandiwe laughed, surprised. You want to be a medic? I want to help people like you helped me, Sena signed. I want to see things other people don't see and fix them. Then yes, Thandiwe said, her heart full. When you're older, I'll teach you everything I know. Malik had been hiding behind Thandiwe, shy in the enormous house, but now Sena noticed him. She switched to awkward English, clearly practicing for this moment. Hello. I am Sena. You are? Malik, her son mumbled. Want to see my room? I have games. And just like that, the two children ran off, leaving the adults behind. Min-jae watched them go with an expression Thandi couldn't quite read. She's different already, he said quietly. More confident. More engaged. I didn't realize how much the silence was isolating her until it was gone. She'll need time to adjust, Thandi said. This is overwhelming for her. New sounds, new ways of communicating, relearning how to interact with the world. Be patient with her. I will be. Min-jae gestured to the couch. Please, sit. I need to discuss something with you. They sat. A housekeeper brought coffee without being asked, expensive coffee in delicate cups that Thandi was afraid to touch. I've been thinking about what happened, Min-jae said. About how close I came to never discovering the truth. If you hadn't been working that shift, if you hadn't noticed, if you hadn't had the courage to approach me despite knowing who I am, Sena would still be deaf. She might have lived her entire life in silence because of other people's greed and my own blind trust. You can't think like that. What matters is that she's better now. What matters, Min-jae said firmly, is that you gave my daughter her hearing back. You gave her a future I thought was impossible. That creates a debt I can never fully repay, but I'd like to try. Mr. Kwon, you already gave me more money than. I'm offering you a job, he interrupted. Not working for me directly, because I understand that my business might make you uncomfortable. But I own several legitimate enterprises, including a private medical clinic that serves the expatriate community in Lagos. I need a director of emergency services. Someone with practical experience, good judgment, and the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. The salary would be 3 times what you're making now at both your current jobs. Full benefits for you and Malik. Housing assistance. Education fund for your son. Thandi stared at him. I'm not a doctor. I'm not even a licensed nurse yet. I'm still working on my certification. I'm not offering this because of your credentials. I'm offering it because you're the kind of person who sees a child suffering and risks everything to help, even when that child's father is a man most people cross the street to avoid. That's the kind of person I want in my clinic. That's the kind of person who saves lives. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. Talk to my HR director. Tour the facility. Meet the staff. Then decide. Min-jae pulled out another card, this one with contact information for the clinic. No pressure. No obligation. But the offer is real, and it's yours if you want it. Thandi took the card, her hands shaking slightly. This was the kind of opportunity that changed lives, that provided security and stability she'd only dreamed of since Joseph died, but accepting it meant tying herself to Min-jae's world, even tangentially, and that world was dangerous in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. Can I ask you something? She said. Your reputation. The things people say about you. Are they true? Min-jae didn't flinch from the question. Some of them. I built my empire through means that wouldn't survive legal scrutiny. I've hurt people who threatened what's mine. I operate in spaces where violence is a form of business negotiation. I won't apologize for that or pretend to be something I'm not. Then why should I trust you? Because my daughter trusts you, he said simply. And I trust my daughter's judgment more than I trust my own. Because you've already seen me at my worst and my most vulnerable, and you treated me with kindness instead of fear. Because, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Because I think you understand that people are more than the worst things they've done. Your husband was a soldier. He killed people in combat. Does that make him a murderer, or does context matter? That's different. Is it? Violence in service of protecting something you love versus violence for profit or territory. The outcomes are the same. Dead bodies, grieving families. What differs is the justification we give ourselves. Thandi wanted to argue, but the logic was uncomfortably sound. Joseph had been killed. She knew this. He'd told her once, late at night, about a firefight outside Maiduguri where he'd picked up a rifle from a wounded soldier and returned fire, hitting at least 2 insurgents. He'd saved lives that day. He'd also ended them. She'd never loved him less for it. I need time, she said finally, Take all you need. The offer stands regardless. Min-jae stood, signaling the conversation's end. For now, please stay for lunch. Sena will be devastated if you leave before she's shown you her entire collection of things that make sounds. They stayed for lunch, which was an elaborate spread of Korean and Nigerian dishes prepared by Min-jae's staff. Sena insisted on sitting between Thandiwe and Malik, asking constant questions about sounds, naming everything she heard, laughing with pure delight at her own voice. Malik, initially shy, warmed up to her quickly, and soon they were conspiring like old friends. Min-jae watched them with an expression that made Thandiwe's chest ache. This was a man who'd built an empire through ruthlessness, who commanded fear and respect in equal measure, reduced to near tears by the sound of his daughter laughing. Whatever else he was a father who loved his child with devastating intensity. After lunch, Min-jae took Thandiwe aside again. There's something else you should know. I've filed formal complaints against Dr. Adeyemi and the other specialists who examined Sena over the years. My lawyers are building a case for medical malpractice and fraud. This will likely be a very public scandal. Good, Thandiwe said fiercely. What they did to Sena was unconscionable. They should face consequences. I agree. But you'll likely be called to testify. Your observation and intervention will be central to the case. Are you prepared for that kind of attention? Thandiwe thought about it. Public testimony meant exposing herself and Malik to scrutiny, possibly to retaliation from Dr. Adeyemi's colleagues and supporters. But it also meant justice for Sena and potentially protecting other patients from similar negligence. Yes, she said. I'll testify. They need to answer for what they did. Min-jae smiled, and it was the first genuinely warm smile she'd seen from him. Thank you. For everything. If you've made it this far in the story, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and leave a comment letting us know what you thought. Your support means everything and helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one. Over the next 3 months, Thandiwe's life transformed. She accepted Min-jae's job offer after touring the clinic and meeting the staff, all of whom were professional, competent, and genuinely excited about building something excellent. The salary was life-changing. She moved Malik to a better school, found a larger apartment in a safer neighborhood, and started her nursing certification program with the financial stress lifted. Sena's recovery progressed beautifully. She attended auditory therapy 3 times a week, learning to process and interpret the sounds that flooded her newly opened world. Her speech developed rapidly, moving from single words to full sentences in Korean, with English and Igbo following close behind. She remained fluent in sign language and insisted on teaching Malik, creating a private language between them. The two families grew close in ways that surprised everyone. Malik and Sena became inseparable, spending weekends at each other's homes. Min-jae, discovering he enjoyed the presence of children's chaos, often had both kids over, teaching them Korean cooking and letting them make enormous messes in his pristine kitchen. Thandiwe and Min-jae developed something harder to name. Not quite friendship, not quite romance, but a deep mutual respect and understanding born from shared loss and the profound experience of Sena's healing. They had dinner together weekly, sometimes with the kids, sometimes alone, talking about everything and nothing. Min-jae told her about his wife Amara, how they'd met in Seoul when he was trying to expand his business into African markets, how her family had disowned her for marrying a Korean man with questionable business practices, how she'd died believing Sena would never hear her voice. Thandiwe told him about Joseph, about the weight of loving a soldier who believed in dying for something greater than himself, about the hollow years after his death when she'd functioned purely on survival instinct. They recognized in each other the specific scar tissue that forms around grief, the way it never fully heals but becomes part of your structure, load-bearing and permanent. The medical malpractice case became a national scandal. Dr. Adeyemi and 3 other specialists were charged with fraud, criminal negligence, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical records showed repeated notations about possible physical obstructions that were never investigated, financial records revealed kickback schemes for treatment referrals, and expert testimony confirmed that Sena's condition should have been diagnosed and treated years earlier. Thandiwe testified clearly and powerfully, describing exactly what she'd observed in the grocery store and why it concerned her. The defense attorneys tried to discredit her, questioning her credentials and suggesting she'd been motivated by financial gain, but Thandiwe's honesty and evident compassion undermined every attack. When asked why she'd approached Min-jae despite the obvious risk, she'd looked directly at the jury and said, "Because I saw a little girl who was suffering, and I knew I could help. That's what healers do. We help." Dr. Adeyemi was eventually convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison, stripped of his medical license, and ordered to pay significant restitution. The other doctors faced similar consequences. The case prompted a nationwide review of pediatric hearing loss protocols and mandatory second opinions for irreversible diagnoses. Sena, now 10, attended a regular school for the first time, using hearing aids to support her recovering auditory system. She excelled, particularly in science and languages, and told anyone who would listen that she was going to be a doctor when she grew up. Not like the bad doctors, she would clarify. Like Dr. Okoro and Miss Thandi. The kind who actually help people. On the anniversary of Sena's healing, Min-jae threw a party. Not a large affair, just close friends and the extended family they'd built together. Dr. Okoro came, as did several nurses from the clinic. Mrs. Okonkwo brought her famous jollof rice. Malik and Sena performed a song they'd been practicing, singing in English and Korean, their young voices clear and true. Afterward, when the party had wound down and the kids were asleep in Sena's room, Thandi and Min-jae sat on his balcony overlooking Lagos, the city lights spreading below them like fallen stars. "I've been thinking about something," Min-jae said. "A year ago, I would have said my life was defined by power and control. I had built an empire, commanded respect and fear, accumulated wealth and influence. But I couldn't fix the one thing that mattered. I couldn't help my daughter. I was powerless in the only way that actually counts." "And now?" Thandi asked. "Now I understand that real power isn't about control. It's about connection. About letting the right people into your life and trusting them to see what you can't see. About being vulnerable enough to accept help." He looked at her directly. "You changed everything, Thandi. Not just for Sena. For me too. You're giving me too much credit. I just noticed something others missed. You did more than notice. You acted. You risked yourself for strangers. You gave my daughter back her voice and gave me back hope I didn't know I'd lost." He reached over and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "I don't know what we are to each other, and I'm not asking you to define it. But I want you to know that you and Malik are family now. Whatever you need, whatever challenges you face, we face them together. That's a promise." Thandi squeezed his hand back, emotion thick in her throat. "Joseph used to say that family isn't always about blood, it's about who shows up when things are hard. Who sees you at your worst and chooses to stay anyway." He sounds like he was a wise man. He was. You would have liked him. I think I would have. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city breathe below them. Inside, Sena stirred and called out, probably waking from a dream. Min-jae started to rise, but Thandi touched his arm. "I'll go," she said. She might want a woman's comfort. She found Sena sitting up in bed, Malik still asleep beside her. The girl had tears on her cheeks but was smiling. "Bad dream?" Thandi asked softly. "No," Sena said in English, her pronunciation nearly perfect now. "Good dream. I dreamed about my mama. She was singing to me, and I could hear her. I never heard her voice before, but in the dream I knew it was her, and she sounded like bells and honey and home." Thandi sat on the edge of the bed and pulled Sena into a hug. "That sounds like a beautiful dream. Miss Thandi, do you think she knows? That I can hear now?" "I think wherever she is, she knows. And I think she's proud of you. So proud." "I'm proud of Appa too," Sena said. "He never gave up on me. Even when everyone said nothing could be done, he kept trying. That's love, right? Never giving up?" "That's exactly what love is," Thandi agreed, her eyes stinging. I love you too, Sena said simply. You saved me. You're like my second mama. Thandi couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She just held Sena tighter, this beautiful brave child who'd lived 9 years in silence and emerged into sound with grace and gratitude. Behind them, Malik stirred and mumbled something in his sleep. Sena giggled and lay back down, pulling her blanket up. Stay until I fall asleep? She asked. Of course. Thandi sat beside the bed, holding Sena's hand, listening to both children breathe in the peaceful rhythm of sleep. Through the window, Lagos hummed its endless song of traffic and voices and life. The world was full of sound, beautiful and terrible and everywhere, and Sena could finally hear it all. When Thandi returned to the balcony, Min-jae was still there, looking out over the city. She sat beside him and they stayed like that, two survivors of grief and loss who'd found unexpected grace in each other's company, until the sun began to rise and paint Lagos in shades of gold. Can I ask you a question? Where in the world are you watching from? Comment below because we would love to know how far these stories travel, and hit that subscribe button because there are new stories you do not want to miss.